Okay, so we left off. I wanted to kind of put together where we were, the report of Chloe's people, or the divisions in the church, and then the wise and the foolish, the status of believers, the discussion of status. So that's chapters 1 through 4. I want to point out a couple of more features about that section before we move along. And look at how Paul describes it here in this is chapter 3. The metaphor that Paul uses when he's trying to talk about division is the architectural one. Who is assigned work, who is providing the foundation, but it's one house. It's all working together. It's God's building. And he's appealing to this sense of unity as he continues along. What kind of a building is it in verse 16? You're God's temple. God's Spirit dwells within you. So if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy that person. Now this is really just an amazing image, because to this point, the temple in Jerusalem is still standing. There's no reason for Paul to radically personalize the notion of a temple, especially God's temple, which existed in one place, and that is in Jerusalem. So how could Paul make this major shift? What gives Paul sort of this inspiration to take the discussion to this level? We don't really know, but it's a fantastic image that you and I individually become places where God will dwell. You may have heard somebody say that Christianity, one of the tenets is to ask Jesus into your heart. Well, in John's gospel and in the letters of John, Jesus does come and dwell within. Does Paul have that in mind here? It looks like it, but a really important image. Here we have the idea about these leaders and what it adds up to is to belong to Christ. There be no division. How does he strengthen the argument? He points to the ministry of all the apostles, and he says that all of these apostles work together for different purposes. And so whether it's an evangelist or a pastor or a missionary, everybody is to work together. Here he indicts the Corinthians in 4 verse 8. Already you have all you want. Already you have become rich. Quite apart from us, you have become kings. Indeed, I wish that you had become kings so that we might be kings with you. What does he say about the apostleship? He says that they had been ones that were sentenced to death, a spectacle to the world. They are weak, but you are strong. This is a full-on indictment of the arrogance that some of the Corinthian members have taken on in their relationship with some of the others. You know, how do you judge a person's character? Look at how that person treats the lowest status person in the room. And that's a great comment about that person's character. Is there a change? Or does that person, or do they treat them as equals with respect and love and care? Paul is indicting these folks. And he says, even them, the apostles who are delivering this message, we have become like the rubbish of the world, the dregs of all things to this very day. And then he has to say this, right? I'm not writing this to shame you, but to admonish you as my beloved children. You might have 1,000 guardians, but you only have one father. So he is making a full-on appeal that they embrace the wisdom that he is trying to teach them. That's chapters 1 through 4. Now, chapter 5 is a report about sexual immorality. And it's a rocky one. It's a rocky case. The case is about a son, a man living with his father's wife. So he's taking on his stepmother as a consort. And as if that's not bad enough, Paul says that person expects to be allowed into the church with full benefits and without any kind of discipline. And Paul says not at all. This person has to be disciplined. And when you assemble, you've got to put that person out of the church. That cannot remain. So you got to judge this. Is when Paul talks about sexual immorality, it can get a little difficult for us as we're 2,000 years removed. But I will say this: when you look at this case, this is a case where a person has used a relationship for his own benefit. And to me, if you're looking to try to draw a Pauline ethic that's applicable now, just as it would have been applicable in the first century, that's it. And here it is in a different way. When you seek a relationship to add to it, you're in good shape. When you seek a relationship to draw from it, you're in danger. A relationship is supposed to be reciprocal, mutual, and full of unconditional love. If that's the relationship you're pursuing, then you're going in the right direction. Paul seems to indicate that when he says this is not an anything goes mentality, that there are standards to maintain, and this is the strictest language that I think I can find with Paul. Usually Paul wants to put everybody at the table. Here he has some strong words. He wants that person to be disciplined. Chapter 6 deals with lawsuits among believers. This is interesting. His case is that why not be wronged? Why would you let wrongdoers be the judge? Instead, why not suffer wrong and let God work things out? Now, this is a theological point. The theological point is that if we sacrifice ourselves, if we certainly can't take another Christian to court, but why not suffer the wrong and avoid the court system entirely? And if you could take that and package it, right, for our country that claims to be Christian, think about how litigation would dry up. We're so interested in preserving our own rights all the time. Here it's a little different. Paul is saying that we ought to look to the interests of others. This is a very interesting passage. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food. That's a quote from a philosopher. And God will destroy both. This is where Paul is trying to admonish the church to maintain remember those 3 rules at the Jerusalem Council. Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. Don't eat meat strangled in its own blood. And avoid sexual immorality. And it seems to me Paul is looking at those things and trying to encourage this Gentile congregation to modify its self-interest to reflect the call of God and this new ethos provoked by the Spirit of God, the Spirit of the risen Christ. Paul offers some answers to questions in chapter 7. He talks about marriage, and he talks about how each person should be faithful to the other. And notice the wife does not have authority over her own body. The husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So be careful not to pigeonhole Paul in terms of his misogyny. That may come out in a little bit later section. But here Paul notices the reciprocity between husbands and wives. A reciprocity, by the way, that tends to be overrun in more fundamental circles, where the husband is supposed to be, quote unquote, the head of the house, drawing usually from Ephesians. But if you look at the Ephesians passage, you'll notice that the husband is the head of the wife, as the husband has a head over him, which is Christ. And how did Christ submit? Christ submitted even to his own sacrifice and death on the cross. So there's a genuine reciprocity here, not some kind of an overbearing leadership. Paul says, I wish, verse 7, that everybody was like me, but each one has a particular gift from God. So to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it's well for them to remain unmarried, but if they can't practice self-control, they should marry. These are Paul's things. To the married, he gives a command. And he says, not I, but the Lord. This is something that Paul feels is coming right from the Lord, that wives and husbands shouldn't separate over the gospel, but remain united. What does he mean? He means that a believing wife should not leave her unbelieving husband, and a believing husband should not leave an unbelieving wife. Notice how he says it here further on. He says that maybe the husband is made holy through the wife. In this relationship that God sacralizes, maybe there's a grace here that goes beyond what you can fashion. What's the overriding principle? Again, sacrifice your own self-interest for the blessing of someone else. Now, so often, as is the case, I get questions from a lot of different points of view on this, whether it's at a school or a church or whatever. And certainly Paul is not interested in somebody staying in a relationship where violence is going to be done upon them. You must not stay in a relationship that's so violent and maintain some sort of pious sanctimony about it. Instead, I think that the person gets safety and works things out from that a place of safety. Anyway, that's the way this goes. So Paul is giving the command, not the Lord, as he moves forward here. He wants them to stay. Here it is. Now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion. So what is he talking about with this idea of remaining in your station? If you recall from your reading of 1 Thessalonians, the overriding concern there was the return of Christ, the imminent return. Any day now that the Lord would show up, as 1 Thessalonians would say, with the archangel and the angel army, with the blast of the trumpet. Why would you encumber yourself with relationships when the turning of the age is underway? Now, Paul is still within that mindset and still maintains it, but you can begin to sense that some of his more austere positions are beginning to shift just a bit to make an accommodation for those who can't practice self-control. In Thessalonians, they all quit their jobs and they didn't work, and they exchanged relationships. They thought since Jesus was coming back, what's the difference? 1 Corinthians is a little bit of a different book, separated by a number of years. And so Paul is becoming a little more mature in his presentation to the churches. Again, remember, these are specific letters to specific churches. These are not supposed to be taken as blanket doctrinal or ethical statements, but rather situational and regarding these little places. Now, for Christian communities, we treat these letters as authentic, authoritative, and that's for Christian communities, that's a little different. But as you read them, try to read them with your eyes open, noticing the shifts and trying to explain those shifts by way of an appeal to what we cannot see. This mirror reading is something we perpetually do, trying to extrapolate from the letter that we have what the issue was for that first church. The last point Paul's going to make in chapter 8 has to do with the food that's offered to idols. And it's interesting. When you get to this point, it looks like there is a difference in Paul. And the difference seems to be in the strong and in the weak. The weak in the faith seems to hold up that you cannot eat that food offered to an idol, for it'll pollute you, whereas the strong in the faith seem to be able to eat that meat sacrificed to an idol since they realize that there's no other God. What is, again, the point? The point is that you don't want to cause one of your fellow believers to stumble or to sin or to be angry, and so you defer to that one if you must, whether it's eating or not. Now, this is going to be an overarching thematic element when Paul writes. And so we would review those things from the Apostolic Council that you already know. Don't eat meat sacrificed to an idol. Don't eat meat strangled in its own blood, and avoid sexual immorality. So maybe Paul has changed just a little bit where he allows the strong in the faith to eat, but bottom line is you should consider your neighbor first. That gives you a bird's eye view of the first 8 chapters of 1 Corinthians. We'll come back with the next few chapters in the next video.